Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is taking the time to join us for this really interesting conversation with the Honorable Nikhil Seth of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and Professor Melvis Ndiloseh. This discussion is going to focus on the importance of training and capacity development in the area of electoral policy and administration. And the event is brought to you in collaboration with Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. And it aims to facilitate a dialogue between UNITAR, Mr. Nikhil Seth, and Professor Melvis to explore the key theme of electoral governance, UNITAR's training and development uh, capacities and initiatives, and the important area of public diplomacy in a world that is in constant flux. So, without further ado, let me briefly introduce you first to the Honorable Nikhil Seth. He was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as the UN Assistant Secretary General, the Executive Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR for short. Both assuming the post of UNITAR's Executive Director, Nikhil was the Director of the Division for Sustainable Development, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations Secretariat in New York. Mr. Seth's division was also responsible for supporting the intergovernmental negotiations for the post-2015 development agenda, which is adopted by the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit in 2015. During his career with the United Nations since 1993, Nikhil Seth has served as Special Assistant and Chief of the Office of the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs from September 93 to June 2001, Chief of the Policy Coordination Branch in the Division of ECOSEC, Support and Coordination, from June 2001 to January 2003, and the Secretary of the Economic and Social Council and the Second Committee of the General Assembly from February 2003 to August 2006, and as Director of the DESA Office for ECOSEC Support and Coordination, again from August 2006 to August 2011, where he guided the ECOSEC work in implementing several new key mandates, including its annual ministerial review, development, and the cooperation forum. Nikhil, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to have this important conversation with us. Thank you. And then an absolute honor to welcome Professor Melvis Ndiloseh. She is an associate professor of international studies and law. She has over 12 years of experience in teaching, research, consulting, policy analysis, and advisory and program management with both international and research institutions like the Carter Center, IDA, OU, UNDP, and CIPRI, and the list goes on. Her areas of specialization are democratic governance, human rights, transitional justice, peace and security. Professor Melvis was a 2017 Yale Ward Fellow and holds a PhD in politics, human rights, and sustainability. She's currently the lead of the MEPA program, and she brings with her both the theoretical and the field experience from several electoral contexts in Africa and North America. Professor Melvis, to you as well, we extend a most sincere thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I could kindly give the word to Professor Melvis and just briefly give us your introductory comments, please. You are muted, Professor.
All right. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, and to have this conversation on what I believe is quite topical and very timely issues around governance and policies. Just really thank you for a start, and then we would delve into more specific questions and answers when we get to it.
Thank you, Professor Melvis. Mr. Seth, please, some opening comments from you.
Well, John Hans and Professor Melvis, such a pleasure to be with all of you in this very interesting conversation on democratic governance and so many other issues which are interlinked. I thank you for your very generous introduction, John Hans, and I'm just sharing my thoughts initially on how these activities related to strengthening capacities in many of the issues around elections are so important for strengthening democratic processes globally. Now, we all know the democracy itself is a complex set of issues, but the starting point of democracy in many ways is to have credible, free, and fair elections. That is not the sum total of democracy, but it's one of the most important preconditions for having a democratic system. Now, the areas in which we've been working in building capacity around elections, free, fair, credible elections, are around electoral training, mission support, and mentoring. For example, our training focuses on ensuring that elections are conducted fairly, transparently, and in line with the highest international standards. This includes building the expertise of election officials and administrators at all levels, helping establish best practices that promote knowledge sharing between countries. This is very important because I'm from India. India has just come out of one of the most massive electoral processes that the world has ever seen. And everything I see is in the millions. There are 860 million eligible voters. There are 1 million trucks that were used. There were millions of electronic voting machines. There were millions of people who were engaged, administrators and others engaged in the process. So that is worth sharing. The type of experience India has had in these several rounds of democratic elections is a very important experience which we need to share. And these best practices are suitable for many parts, particularly of the developing world. And our UNITAR programs focus on practical, hands-on training to develop the real-world skills, borrowing from the best practices all around the world, and mentoring allows for ongoing support and guidance beyond the initial training. So it's not as if we focus on a one-off training, but we try and sustain and deepen the knowledge of the people we initially train in this regard. It also includes technical assistance to national electoral commissions. You all know that electoral commissions play a vital role in administrating free and fair elections. Giving technical assistance to electoral officials strengthens institutional capacity and effectiveness, including through legal and regulatory frameworks, through the voter registration systems, the results management and transmission, the use of appropriate technologies tailored to each country's specific needs and context. And then there are the observers who are involved in national elections, national observers, and there's learning to be done for domestic election observation, which is crucial for transparency and public confidence. And this training includes international standards and best practices, again, impartial and objective monitoring techniques, and reporting methodologies. So the last component I'd like to mention is civil society and the role of empowering civil society to play an active role in the electoral process, which complements the international observation efforts. Now, all these steps that I'm outlining are really to establish the credibility of a national election process. I gave you the example of India and the mammoth electoral system and process and the election commission itself and the role it played, the millions of people who joined in this effort. But there are other examples which are not as effective. And every few months we hear of elections which are fraudulent, which lack credibility, which has vote rigging, stuffing of ballot papers, which have all kinds of irregularities which challenge the robustness and credibility of these kinds of elections. So the training and learning component will greatly help in improving the credibility and the objectivity in conducting free and fair elections, which is the starting point, as I mentioned, in this complex thing called an efficient democracy. Thank you, John Hans.
Thank you so much, Mr. Seth. Ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to use the chat box. And if you, as both Professor Melvis and Mr. Seth engages with us, please feel free if there are any specific questions you would like to pose to them at the end of our session. Please feel free to pop it in the chat box, and then it would be a pleasure to draw on some of your questions so that we can do a deeper dive into the discussion. Professor Melvis, Mr. Seth was just explaining to us that democracy is really not a straightforward process, and that it is quite complex, and there are so many different partners involved in it. And may I please ask you, with your experience and background in governance and policy analysis, how do community leadership and the inclusion of those different voices impact governance and policy making and the processes to ensure that emerging democracies can deliver for its communities?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the importance, and I think this is one of the things that when you talked about opening remarks, I should have mentioned how this became an issue of interest to me. First and foremost, how did I get into the field of democracy and peace building, and how I have come to really think that this is central to societies, and especially those that are emerging out of conflict. It started back in 1994 when I was a kid, and my parents had just bought our very first television set. And we had very limited screen time. We were only allowed to watch news reports every 7:30 p.m. in the evening. And every 7:30 p.m., we would watch the news, repeated broadcast. I would see on the TV women carrying their children on their backs and heavy loads on their heads, mattresses, and they're fleeing from conflict zones. I later on learned that that was the Rwandan genocide. And every day, during the news, it was repeatedly broadcast for about a month. And so that sort of ingrained in my mind. I started asking questions. Who are these people? Why are they being killed? Why all the killing? Why are they running? How can the perpetrators be stopped? How can these societies be rebuilt? How can people build trust and come to, live together again? So those questions ultimately informed my academic trajectory, and ultimately informed the approach that I generally take when it comes to policy analysis and just, diagnosing issues around democracy. I do think that in terms of approach, personally, I emphasize a victim-centered approach. I emphasize inclusivity across the board. I emphasize data-driven policies. Whatever is being done, there must be evidence from the field in terms of that. And everything that Nikhil said, he kept giving several examples. That is the evidence of that, of the priorities that he's laying out. And of course, a right-based approach. Now, with these in mind, looking at the different emerging democracies, especially I would focus again on the post-conflict, in post-conflict situations, and the importance of including the community or community leadership in that sense. 80% really of the impact of conflict and governance deficits is felt at the community level. Now, whether we are talking about issues around environmental degradation and how that is impacting agriculture and rural agriculture in the communities, or we are talking about the difficulties we're talking about electoral participation. It's generally lower at the community level than in the rural and mostly and urban areas, or whether we are talking about just general questions of inclusion or dispossession from livelihoods when it comes to conflict. These impacts are being felt at the community level for first and foremost. And so with the victim-centered approach in mind, there is no way that we can talk about building a community or a peace building process, understanding this as the spectrum of measures that is taken to rebuild communities or to prevent violence or, you know, resolve violence or rebuild a country. It really starts at the community level, and therefore including these voices is really not is a minimum starting point. It's not an issue where a lot of advocacy should be made around. It has to be just considered as the natural starting point, especially, you know, in this context where questions of equity, questions of representation are crucial, and where addressing the legacies of marginalization and exclusion is fundamental to rebuilding any sort of any society. I'll give you an example. More recently, I've carried out 2 conflict and violence assessments recently in Sudan, in the Central African Republic, actually 3, and one that's ongoing. There is a huge sense of government alienation by the people at the community level. You speak with people and they feel like the government isn't there, it doesn't care. And this is because of the huge gap, you know, not just in terms of government presence, but also when it comes to actual consultation of the community leaders, those who are living these realities and those who are dealing with them on a day-to-day basis. And I will just close this really quickly with a short story of an Italian development program who shares the story of how they went to Zambia to introduce a development project in Zambia. It's actually a TED Talk. And he said they went to the Zambezi River and they saw that it was a very fertile area, and they tried to talk to the people in the community to farm tomatoes, and they were initially hesitant. So they went ahead and they did a sample, and it was very productive, and the people said, okay. And they tried to use that as a reason to convince the people to do large-scale tomato farming around the Zambezi River. And they went ahead, tried to pay the people, do everything to mobilize them to be involved in this farming. It yielded very, very well. And they told the people, see, you didn't know that you needed agriculture. We came to save your life. This is agriculture. This is how this can work. And then overnight, they woke up and they realized that the hippos had come out of the Zambezi River and absolutely ate all the tomatoes. And so they turned to the people and like, look, the hippos. And the people said, yep, that's why we don't farm tomatoes in this area. So if you had asked us, it's like, well, but why didn't you tell us? Well, because you didn't ask. And so again, we cannot overemphasize the importance of involving the community and making sure that they lead the process in the identification of needs, in the design of the programs, and in the implementation of programs, because that's the only way that will ensure representation, inclusiveness, local ownership, and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Melvis. And really what you highlighted there is the importance of involving the community, listening to the community, and identifying the reality of the context and the social cultural environment. I would like to ask both of you to build further on what you both have said. Mr. Seth, you mentioned India, and there is a giant of peaceful resistance, Mahatma Gandhi, and the legacy that he has left the world. And when we look at the complexity today, when we talk about local communities and the impacts of populism and globalization, because the impacts is very different for certain communities across the globe. And we also see the ever increasing impact of global warming and the urgency to deal with global warming. So could I please ask both of you to speak about the socioeconomic necessity in any of these programs and collaborative partnerships that you have? Because as you both have said, if a community is not able to have the financial economic independence, a society and a community will continue to be in need. So how does one balance that socioeconomic dimension in the collaborative partnerships? Nikhil, if we could start with you, please.
John Hans, let me start first by going back to the example of India and our electoral history, and the fact that as a result of our electoral history, both pre-independence and post-independence, the right to vote and the right to the sanctity of the electoral process has become a part of the DNA of the citizens of the country. So what happens, if you look at pictures of Indian elections, you'll see the poorest of the poor, the disabled, the older persons, the most disadvantaged people in society, standing with that gleam in their eyes at the ballot, wanting to vote, to exercise this sacred franchise that they have. So yes, economic and social issues are important, but the right to vote is so strong and the desire to vote is so strong that it transcends the economic and social situations in which the citizens find themselves. Now, this is very different from different parts of the world, especially as Professor Melvis pointed several times to countries in conflict, countries emerging from conflict, countries where it's not safe sometimes to go out and take part in electoral processes, and how important it is to create that same feeling of safety, security, and sanctifying the right and the obligation to go and vote for the leadership that you necessarily want for enriching the democratic process. So yes, economic and social issues are important, but I would say that if you compare, I don't have the data here in front of me, but if you look at the turnout in electoral processes, you'll find that in many countries, including in India, despite poorer levels, poverty levels being higher, despite literacy levels being lower, the turnout in elections is much higher in many developed countries where, which are much richer, which have a stronger socioeconomic base, a higher literacy base. So that creation of that culture of the right to vote and the sanctity of that, I personally think is one of the most important aspects of creating a system in where people want to go out and cast their vote in the hope that they'll get the leaders they want. Back to you, Jones.
Thank you so much, Mr. Seth. Professor Melvis, your reflections?
Yes. So really, I just want to correlate, that which has already been said, but also drawing from the African experience to say that this is really socioeconomic issues are really central to electoral processes in many ways. When we can even start with issues of participation, exercising the right to vote is very key, but the socioeconomic factors are crucial for determining the extent to which people even go to exercise these rights. There are communities where people sometimes have to choose between whether or not they would have a meal or pay for the documentation that they need to register and therefore exercise that right to vote. They know there are laws that guarantee their rights to vote, but the socioeconomic conditions also determine the extent to which they can actually benefit or, exercise those rights or these civil duties and responsibilities that they have. So that's the first level. Socioeconomic issues also have implications for inclusion, gender inclusion. At various levels, whether it's as candidates in electoral processes or even just the capacity to carry out campaigns. There are countries where most of the times you have to pay a certain amount of money to register as a candidate. And those socioeconomic factors can disenfranchise people at that level in many ways. There is also the fact that politicians tend to exploit these socioeconomic deficiencies and grievances that people have as valence issues for their campaigns, or even to recruit young people as political thugs. Literally, we've seen that in some countries to carry out, their biddings of intimidations here and there because of the lack of viable alternative for self-actualization among young people. So, and then if we think about elections as a process of leadership selection, and most of the times when people are selecting leaders, their goal, the ultimate goal in their mind is we want someone who will be able to make our lives better on a day-to-day basis, to improve our living standards. And these are social and economic issues that also inform the choices that people make when they go to participate in elections. So I'll just, end there for now.
Thank you so much, Professor Melvis. Could I ask again our participants that are joining us from different corners of the globe, please feel free to pop your questions, because in the next 10 minutes, I'd be very happy to draw on your questions. We have participants from Mado City, we have participants from Palestine, we have participants from Malawi, from New York, Nigeria, Portugal, Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and listening to some of these incredible exchanges from the Honorable Nikhil Seth and Professor Melvis. Professor Melvis, if I can please come back to you and ask you to share with us a little bit how important the integration of the gender perspective is in both governments and peace-building projects.
Thank you for the question. Recently, I was attending a workshop that was organized by SIHA. It's the on women and transitional justice in Sudan. And one of the things that I found, let me just say that I found strange, was that we were all sitting there trying to defend that which was obvious. Trying to advocate, for the inclusion of women in transitional justice processes, for instance, in Sudan. But when we look at the data, again, coming back to what I consider my personal approach, data-driven, rights-based, inclusivity, victim-centeredness. When we look at the facts, the demography, the scope of the violations that have been that women have endured in the recent conflict in Sudan, for instance, when we look at those who are on the peace table having these conversations, and when we look at the drivers of this conflict, because we have to be addressing the drivers in every the success of the peace process depends on the extent to which the drivers of conflict are addressed, and the approaches prioritize the victims. So there are several precedents. A lot of research has already been undertaken on the importance of women and peace building process, of incorporating women voices, women-led peace building process. They've proven themselves in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in many other countries. The many ways in which the women are able to channel the realities on the ground, and how they are being affected, and approaches that would be that are more restorative as well, you know, versus just criminal approaches. I'm speaking again in this particular on this particular point. My focus is on transitional justice and involving the voices of women. So that for me in that particular meeting was what stood out. Like, why are we even sitting here to justify that which is so obvious? And the reason is because most of the times when you look at these peace conversations, the exclusions that preceded the conflict continue to happen, to play out before us on these peace tables. Most of the times women are invited to peace talks and they're left on the corridors. The actual discussions that are being had on the hardcore issues continue to exclude women. You have situations where the involvement of women in peace process is just being done for window dressing, just for the sake of it. Let's get a woman and have that woman on the table so that we can tick this particular box on gender inclusion. I think that there is need to go beyond that. It is not an item to be ticked on any box of any conversation. It is actually central, and experiences in many countries, and some of those which I have already cited, has more than proven the importance and the necessity of gendered approaches, whether it's to peace building or to elections, or it's to governance and election management, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Melvis. Mr. Seth, if I could please ask you to build on this question, but also can I ask you, in your experience from the time that you helped to articulate the Sustainable Development Goals and fast forward to today, do you feel the same as Professor Melvis, or do you also see that no, there are contexts and there are concrete initiatives that has really helped to accelerate and to address this must-have conversation about the importance of gender integration and gender equality?
Let me first very strongly endorse what Professor Melvis has said, because I also feel very strongly that giving a clear, loud, and articulate voice to women is probably one of the most important things that can be done in most societies. And of course, conflict is often due to a sense of injustice, which comes out in societies, and a sense that trust and justice will not prevail in our societies. And that is the reason for much of the conflict. But I also see that the greatest injustice through history has been gender injustice. And how do we rectify that? How do we create a culture where women feel equally involved and engaged in matters that can change things so dramatically, especially in the area of peace and ending conflict? So I strongly endorse what she's saying. We still have to map out an effective way. I think this has to be kind of done society by society. There is no magic template which we can apply from one society to the other. The only magic template is the determination to do something for your societies, for your communities, which are different from what has happened over all these decades and centuries. So if that political determination is there, that will of the community and the people is there, only then will change come. And there is, once again, no magic formula that can be thrust down all societies. but we have to struggle in each society to come up with the magic formula which works for the society and the community. So that's where our struggle is. We've not done well in this area, and I hope our conversation will help galvanize forces of the type Professor Melvis is articulating to bring about the change, particularly in gender. I see there's a question also from Ian on election commissions and their role in civic education. I think having a free and independent election commission who articulate the points of view of the election commission around elections loudly and clearly through the process, in fact, starting well before the actual elections are held, is a very, very important part of the role of election commissions, especially in today's era, where we see misinformation and disinformation, which is the most talked about negative of the application of artificial intelligence and how that can distort electoral processes. And I think the role of the election commission, a credible election commission, in dispelling doubts about the credibility of elections and working their way through society and citizens on what needs to be done for them to get registered, for them to go and vote, access to the right ballot boxes. All that is a very important part of the work of election commissions. Back to you, John Ans.
Thank you so much, Mr. Seth, for picking up on the question of Ian. If I could ask you, Professor Melvis, Fatuma Mohammed Ibrahim posed 3 questions, and I would like to pose the second question. What are the main barriers preventing women from participating in peace processes in the Horn of Africa? Professor Melvis? Okay, Professor Melvis is blocked for the moment. Professor Melvis is black. Professor Melvis, did you get the question? I repeat it for you again. So Fatuma Mohammed is posing 3 questions, and I would like to engage on the second one. What are the main barriers preventing women from participating in peace processes in the Horn of Africa?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Professor Melvis. You have the word.
Okay, good question. There are several barriers to women participation. I think this is really one of the reasons why advocacy continues to be very key. The first, especially around the Horn of Africa, is mainly cultural. There are cultural and religious dimensions to these. And I would give again the example of Sudan, because that's one of the contexts within which I've been working lately. There are also challenges that are related to the economic aspects, the financial aspects to it. Advocacy and actual participation requires, again, sustained engagement of women requires a lot of finances and some degree of education, and these are some of the issues that sometimes limit. The third is legal. I would give again the example of Sudan. So one of the meetings that we had was with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We wanted to talk to them about the importance of engaging, of really pioneering the cause of women and transitional justice in Sudan. And but the commissioner for women's rights, one of the first things she told was like, we're very interested in doing this and running with this cause, but Sudan has not ratified the Maputo Protocol, for instance. And so you have some of those legal constraints as well that that sometimes efforts to promote women participation in legal in peace building processes or in transitional justice process have to find other ways to circumvent in order to seek and get the redress that they rightly do need.
Thank you so much, Professor Melvis. And then the third question, if I could ask both Professor Melvis and Mr. Seth, what measures are being taken to implement the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in the Horn of Africa? If we possibly could start with you, Mr. Seth, and if we can reflect on some of the training and capacity building programs of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research.
On the specific question of Security Council Resolution 1325, I would defer to Professor Melvis. My sort of familiarity with the issues in the Horn of Africa are probably not as great as she has, so I'll defer that. But I think education and learning and capacity building and the quality of that learning are very important. And what we try and do through educational, improvements in the quality of education, of around peace processes, by the partnerships we have built at the community level, by the engagement of religious leaders and faith-based organizations, of bringing the credible community leaders to the fore in making discussions around peace in the community is important, is probably one of the most important facets of the work we do at the country level. But on 1325, I defer to Professor Melvis.
Thank you, Mr. Seth. Professor?
Okay. I think my connection was breaking, but I will just give like a quick summary of the four main aspects that the resolution touches on. As far as it's really it was a groundbreaking resolution with regards to women and peace building. And generally, there is hardly any document on women and peace building or even electoral processes that you won't find referenced to resolution 1325 and its likes. Recently there were four key aspects that it addresses. The first has to do with participation, women participation at basically all levels of program design, implementation, and even in electoral processes. The second aspect of that resolution touched on protection. So protection of the rights of women and women victims through different mechanisms, protection from violation and protection within legal systems, as in their efforts to seek redress to the violations that they have suffered. The third aspect of that resolution dealt with prevention. And the fourth aspect had to do with more issues around recovery. So in every context where peace building is being carried out, or where the United Nations, the African Union, and civil society organizations are seeking to implement these particular resolutions, these are the four aspects that they tend to focus on: issues around participation, protection, prevention, and recovery. And a lot of progress has been made in this regard in different countries that are more advanced in their post-conflict reconstruction phases. But those that are still at the very initial stages of their post-conflict reconstruction phases are still grappling with this. And there is continuous need for its emphasis, its advocacy, its prioritization, and also to empower women to be able to lead processes around this.
Thank you so much. And there is one final question before I'm going to give the word to my colleague, Ms. Meribal Shefran, who is the Master program in Electoral Policy and Administration. Before I pass her the word, I would like to ask both of you, because you've mentioned so many times the importance of recognizing women and the victimization, etc. But how do we then give back to these women the human dignity that they deserve without always being referred to as a victim? How do we do that? Professor Melvis and then Mr. Seth.
Sorry, can you take the question again? I was typing a response to a question on advice to young women in policymaking. Sorry, so go ahead.
Throughout the conversation, we've heard women who are victims and the recognition of the victimhood. But how do we then make sure we give back to them the dignity, the human dignity that they deserve, and that the way in which we then deal with these ladies, that they don't have a label as a victim,
dignity,
their DNA is not just
ladies,
a
that they don't have a label,
dignified human being. How do we restore that dignity?
Let me Professor Melvis thinks of this. You know, many of these issues John Hans, particularly in the social field, including on issues of gender equality, societal engagement in change is probably the most important way of enhancing women's dignity, for example, as in many other social issues. Of course, there is a subsidiary role for so many other things on legislation, on police, on the systems of justice, all kinds of violence and so on. But societal change takes time, and it can come about legislation on police, but it can come about at the community level. There's a slight echo, but maybe that can be solved if we mute our mics. So I think the best way of addressing that, of effective societal change, is once again to forge the right partnerships at the local level, at the community level, with faith-based organizations, with the people who are working, activists and others who are working at the local level, before we move on to the regions and the countries and to the national systems, where we also have to work supplementarily to bring about that change. So in this whole spectrum of actions that need to be taken to enhance the dignity of women, we need to focus first at the local community level and forge the partnerships for change, for increasing the dignity of women, especially in issues relating to conflict and peace, including the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security resolution and the other bigger things that we deliberate on at the international level. But working at the local, working at the community level is probably the most important step for societal change, which would not happen otherwise. Back to you, John Hans.
Thank you so much, Mr. Seth. Professor Melvis, your concluding remarks?
So, first of all, I think there are two parts to the question. The first is really that the fact that women have suffered violations of during conflict, which makes them victim, is actually true. So acknowledging the violations that women have suffered and recognizes that they have been victims, and that this victim is also very structured and quite systematic, is part of addressing the issue. That's the first part. So not discarding the fact that they are victim. Their victimhood is an important part. Recognition of their victimhood is an important part of addressing the challenge. However, the second part, which is what is worrying, is victimhood in the process of policy design and decision making. So if they have already suffered violations at various levels that are systemic. And these continue, looking at treating them as victims in the processes, and therefore not including them when they become victims in the process. That is where there is an issue that needs to be addressed system. In the first level of victimhood that I mentioned, the first part is psychosocial assistance and mental health support. I cannot overemphasize the importance of this. Nothing alters the soul of a woman as much as any direct attack on their dignity. It alters their soul and changes their lives, mindsets, perspective in ways that are very long-term. A recent study was done in Uganda, and it was seen that over 30 to 40 decades since the conflict, women are still dealing with the psychosocial dimensions of the conflicts that were directly linked to their dignity that was stripped from them during the conflict. So being more intentional about psychosocial support and designing these programs as a long-term.
We seem to have some difficulties with the stability of your internet connection, but thank you for your intervention and those very important points that both you and Mr. Seth has raised. Allow me also to say, Professor Melvis, daughter of the African soil, the Honorable Nikhil Seth, son of the Indian soil. Thank you so much for this really powerful message of how important it is to focus on our common humanity and to make sure that we recognize just the immense power of our common humanity in the work that we do. Thank you also for engaging with us in this very important discussion, namely the importance of training and capacity development in the area of electoral policy and administration, electoral governance, and public diplomacy. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my absolute honor to introduce you to my colleague, Maribel Sheran, who I give the word to. Maribel.
Thank you, Jan Hans, and thank you for the speakers for this inspirational dialogue. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm really thrilled to introduce today Saadatu Muazu, the valedictorian of our 2024 MEPA Spring Class. For those unfamiliar with the MEPA program, it is a master's in advanced. It is an advanced program that prepares professionals with the expertise needed to manage and oversee electoral processes globally. Saadatu, one of our graduates, has drafted a thesis on gender violence and its impact on women's participation in Nigeria in the 2023 election. And her study is a powerful testament that offers crucial, insightful information for shaping future election policies. It's my pleasure to invite her today to share her MEPA journey with us. Thank you. You can go.
All right. Good afternoon, all. As I've been introduced, my name is Saada Magaji Muazu. I'm really honored and fulfilled today to be part of this program with such eminent fellows. It is with a great sense of pride to be nominated to say a few words. My journey as a student of Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna has been so transformative, which has made me confident of surmounting challenges, irrespective of my age and the initial concerns of participating in this program. I have been working with the Nigerian Electoral Commission, INEC, for over 20 years now. I was worried when I was nominated for the program. I really didn't think that I needed another degree, but I was really wrong. The journey of MEPA program was so incredible and challenging, but from the commitment of the members of staff of the college to my wonderful tutors, especially Professor Melvis and Miss Maribel, whom I have worked directly with during my research program. And they have become my academic mentors. To my classmates, the interactions gained has given me a long life friendship from all over the world, sharing experiences, learning from different backgrounds, cultures, all to the glory of our prestigious electoral college, Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. And this program, the MAPA program, not only gives you the electoral knowledge, but also improves your confidence in your workplace. To the incoming students, I would like them to embrace the unknown, challenge themselves to be bold and courageous. This will make them a proud alumnus of Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. Thank you for the privilege, and God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Sadatu. Mirabel, thank you so much. The Honorable Mr. Nikhil Seth, Executive Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, Professor Melvis Ndiloseh, from the Master of Electoral Policy and Administration of the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. Thank you so much for participating and for being available to engage with us. But the biggest thank you goes to our audience who have dedicated 1 hour of their time. Thank you most sincerely on behalf of Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Thank you so much. And we wish you all a good afternoon, a good morning, or a good evening. Thank you so much.